Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Janie Montblanc, and on behalf of the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange, the Sage Step Project, the Sage Grouse Initiative, Intermountain West Joint Venture, and the Society for Ecological Restoration, I would like to welcome you to this webinar titled The Ecology, History, Ecohydrology, and Management of Pinyon and Juniper Woodlands in the Great Basin, presented by Rick Miller, Professor Emeritus with Oregon State University. Before I introduce the presenter, I will go over some webinar details. If you have questions or comments, please type them into the questions window of your control panel located at the top right of your screen. I will field the questions after the presentation, but please feel free to submit them during the webinar, as it's nice to have some ready in the queue. I also want to let you know that whatever you do in your control panel does not affect the webinar, so you're welcome to type a test message or test your audio at any time during the webinar. If you're having problems with your audio, please open your audio window and check your audio selections. I also want to let you know that this webinar has been pre-approved for continuing education credits with the Society for Ecological Restoration and the Society for Range Management. And as you all probably saw, I was typing in the code, pre-approval code for SER credits into our closing slide. So you'll get that at the end of the webinar, and we'll also send information for how to receive those credits in the follow-up email that you'll get tomorrow. You'll receive a certificate of attendance after the webinar, and we'll provide information on how to obtain that credit as along with the link to the webinar video as well. Okay, now I'll introduce our presenter. Rick Miller is a Professor Emeritus of Range Ecology with Oregon State University. Rick was on the faculty at Oregon State University for 34 years, working at the Great Basin Experimental Range. He has authored over 100 scientific journal articles, several book chapters, 2 books, and several field guides related to ecology and restoration of Great Basin ecosystems. During his career, he worked closely with the Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Forest Service, National Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and private landowners. After retiring in 2010, he has been working for the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange program with an emphasis on how to evaluate landscapes to predict post-disturbance succession and select the most appropriate land management treatments. Welcome, Rick.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Jenny. We ready to switch screens here?
Yep, let me do that. Making you the presenter right now.
Am I up?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay.
Yeah, there you are.
Okay. And am I in the slide mode?
No.
I'm not in the presenter mode. I am on my screen.
There we go. Maybe it just took a second.
Okay, good. All right, are we ready to go?
Yeah, we're ready to go.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, obviously, I'm not going to cover the whole content of that title, and that's what the synthesis is about. Way too much information. But what I wanted to do today in this webinar is talk a little bit briefly about what the objectives of the synthesis are, a brief overview of the organization and content, and then I wanted to focus in a little bit on some of the key points and concerns and issues that arise just in the process of pulling this information together and working on this, which took me over 4 years to do. The synthesis, basically, as I see the objectives, was really to try to pull together what we know. There's a huge amount of information in the literature, in the PJ. There's a lot of professional experience out there in the field. And I've been lucky with working with Oregon State University to have been able to spend the majority of my time in the field, both doing research and working with a lot of professionals and private landowners during that period of time. I wanted to make it to where at least the practitioners have easy access to information where they can go and find out specific things. You don't have to read the whole document, but find out about seed ecology or what do we know about juniper rooting systems. And I tried to my best. There's several recent papers talk about the percent of success or failure in juniper projects, and I really did my best with this to try to interpret and get into not just reporting what's been found, but why. One paper might have found results A, B seems to be very contrasting, and why those results are different, and then key in on some of the issues. The boundaries of this, initially I was intent on working just in the Great Basin region, but there was some pressure or push to have me at least can take on the northern part of the Colorado Plateau and parts of eastern Colorado, western Colorado. And with that, I just knew I was going to have to bring in a set of co-authors to help me, because this is a big area, and I'm covering some topics that I have just some general background on, but not a real in-depth, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. So it covers a large area, and the boundaries just kind of decided these dashed lines mark some kind of major changes of what's occurring. In fact, I'll go back to this. If you look at the boundary there between the Colorado Plateau and the Great Basin, it's right along the Wasatch Plateau, and that's a big break in terms of where the Pinus edulis, two-needle pinyon, which shows in pink on the right of the slide, pretty much fades out there at the Wasatch, and you pick up the edulis. So that's due to quite an environmental break there. And so looking at this, we know that there's a large monsoonal gradient that you can see in the color mode. The dashed line on the slide to the, well, actually both slides up on the northern, or the farthest one up in the upper part of the slide, represents what some people call the winter boundary. And there's quite a break there in terms of high variability in spring temperatures, cold, warm, to where it can bounce back from very cold to very warm. And that break is probably the variation is the reason why we see very little of the Pinyon moving up north of that boundary, because it breaks dormancy early, and that would be a tough one for it to be able to persist in. Is we see the next line in the middle, of course, is the Wasatch, and when you go north of that, or go east, north, and west of that line, you're dealing with 25% or less summer precipitation. You jump on the other side between that and the lower black line, you're in around 35%. And as soon as you get to that lower black line and towards the bottom of the slide, that's the break basically where we start to lose Utah juniper, and we get into monosperma, which one-seeded is very into a predominantly summer precip. The Wasatch also marks where cool season plants to the north and west are the dominant, and then when we hit the Wasatch and start moving south, we start getting into more warm season, and of course they predominate in the lower areas. So there's some real differences in the ecology and the soil water temperature regimes. The major components of the synthesis are the physical setting, which is the shortest, and it just kind of sets the stage, but there's the physical setting of the whole region, and then the ecology, the history, the ecohydrology, and the restoration. And I'll just spend a couple minutes talking about those in a little more detail. The general physical setting, as I look at it, setting the stage, and it really encompasses not just the PJ Woodland, but kind of what the climate, geology, and topography and soils are both in the Great Basin and Colorado Plateau. And then we get in also into the floristics, which can change quite a bit as we move across that monsoonal gradient. The ecology covers both autoecology and synecology. This was a section that definitely had help with Jean Chambers, particularly the seed ecology section. And Jean is also she's a very good and tough editor. And so she contributed a considerable amount to the editing of this document. It covers taxonomy, morphology of leaves, roots, seed ecology, insects. And then we also hit quite a bit on competition and the overstory-understory relationships and woodland succession. And of course, Bruce Roundy and Robin Tausch have done quite a bit of work in that area, as well as Steve Bunning has. There was the climate change section, which there was a real push to work on that. And that's a tough one just because there's so many uncertainties and you're dealing with a lot of models. But Louisa Evers helped a lot on this section, and she had been working with that right before she retired. The history section is an area that I've always been very interested in, and we pretty much took it from glacial max right up to present glacial max and to that medieval warm period, which is you see kind of there at the Holocene maximum, it represents the largest change in temperature and possibly precip that occurred throughout both the Great Basin and the Colorado Plateau. And I was lucky here that Peter Wigan, a paleobotanist, offered to go ahead and did a very thorough editing and gave some good input on this particular section. In this, towards the end of the section, we did a real emphasis and focus in an area I think most people dealing with woodlands are very interested in, and that's really what's happened in right prior to European Eurasian settlement to up to the present in terms of change, because we know these systems have been dynamic in the past and they continue to be so. And just how do you sort the what was going on to then having some new disturbance regimes introduced to the region. The ecohydrology is one that I have some background in, but not a great amount of depth. And this is where Jason Williams and Keith Snyder, and then they also had some help with Fred Pearson. Those are three people who have done a huge amount of work in the Great Basin and down some into the Colorado Plateau on the hydrology and ecohydrology of these ecosystems. And so they were very valuable in contributing to this particular section. The restoration kind of has two areas. One that I really enjoyed a lot was getting into the history of the restoration work and attempts. And of course, there was some going on with the CCCs back in the 1930s, but it was really a lot during after post-World War II, where a lot of activity and restoration work and started to occur. So we looked at both the history there, and as you can see on that one slide on the right, some of the earliest history I could find of actual documenting prescribed burning occurred in northeastern Arizona back in the about 1950-51 is when that started. I think a big component, which is very important, is looking at current restoration efforts and even past, and really look at both successes and failures and just exactly what we've learned. And we'll talk a little bit about that also a little bit later in the presentation. The key points in this that I'd like to talk a little bit about, and that kind of things that were always kind of bother me at times, is when we get discussing Pinyon Juniper woodlands, oftentimes we just don't really, it's not oftentimes clear, are we talking about persistent woodlands or are we talking about encroached woodlands? And this is something that it really gets kind of into a gray area, both sometimes in the literature, but also with some of the controversy going on in discussions. But even in comparison of literature, where I know I've been in some debates with the roll of fire, non-roll of fire, and I know in one case, the individual was talking about persistent woodlands where it was very infrequent, and we were talking about very productive mountain big sagebrush sites that had been recently encroached by woodlands. And so it's very important to distinguish those components in terms of which are you talking about. And playing, as I often say, a good ecologist is a good detective, that when you look at sites, it's important to evaluate them in terms of, well, is this had been an old woodland that is coming back into a persistent woodland and it had heavy disturbance or harvesting, or has this area been more of a persistent sage steppe community? And there's a lot of evidence on the landscape that a person can use going across the type of an area. And I show this one because this is one that as you walk through it, you're going to find some very old stumps and logs, which is something to look for. You'll find a few old trees, but the density of those are very, very low. And if you look at the soils, which are always an important, very important component to look at, this is a moderately deep soil that has a well-developed mollusk horizon, which means it's high in organic matter that really takes a predominant grass component to form that mollusk horizon in that good organic layer. The old trees you'll find in the background up on the ridges where you get into some of the shallow soil sites, you'll find some of the older seed trees. So looking at both the soils, the landscape position, the potential productivity of the surface fuels on this kind of site are somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 pounds, which are more than adequate to carry fire. So here, fire likely was frequent enough to maintain this more as a persistent grass sage area, as compared to some of our persistent areas, which are more rocky, shallower soils, lower surface fuels, where fires were considerably less frequent. The other thing that oftentimes with some of the issues and discussions that have currently come up is that woodlands are not created equal, that they're highly complex, they're very different, and they which occurs at multiple scales. There's a huge difference in the synthesis. We go into pretty good detail of the range of soils that these pinyon and juniper can grow in, and they can grow in a wide variety of soil textures, from quite sandy to getting into clay soils that are limited by definitely alkali component, and they seem to kind of stay away from the high silty soils, but a very broad difference. And oftentimes, in terms of shallow soil depth, oftentimes you're going to find the old woodlands on shallower rocky soils. The deeper soils, again, oftentimes there's always exceptions, but mostly many of the deeper, more productive sites we'll find we're probably more likely more persistent shrub grasslands. These differences, when being talked about, occur at multiple scales. When you think of the monsoonal effect, Great Basin geology is also very different than Colorado Plateau geology in terms of parent materials and erosive processes and hydrologic cycles. And it gets down to even at regional scales. And so when talking about pinyon juniper woodlands, one really needs to think about what type are actually being discussed. This just shows you a regional difference in disturbance regimes, which I'm sure, historically and prehistorically have been different as you move across this region, and again at multiple scales. And that you can see in the northern part of the Great Basin, when we look at the amount of fires that occurred between 1984 and 2013, we find a higher frequency of fires. Now, part of this is driven by the invasive component of cheatgrass, which has been predominant up farther north, but it's also partly in terms of looking at climate and ignition sources, where we have more we have dry months in the midsummer. We get dry thunderstorms, lightning, unlike the southern Colorado Plateau, where they oftentimes get moisture with lightning. So ignition source and climate, and then fuel loading probably has a factor. As we move north, we're getting into a little cooler temperatures, and we're tending to have probably higher loads of surface fuels. It appeared too also in a lot of the inventories that have been done, that as you move south and east, you tend to find larger proportions of persistent woodlands compared to as you move farther north. This is just an example here. These are all persistent woodlands, at least the slide image up in the Colorado Plateau, which is the top to the right slide, you can see a mosaic. And it's interesting, many times these mosaics you'll find that the more sagebrush open areas tend to be on the deeper soils. And a lot of times you can get concave sites that'll be young stands. If they're trees, there'll be evidence of sagebrush, and then you get on the convex, shallow soils, and you'll see a higher presence of older trees. But you can see a very big difference. The two lower slides, relatively closed, stable, at this point, stable stands of PJ, and yet you see a real difference in understory, and that all has to do with soils. Soil depths, restrictive layer, in the one that has very little growing in the understory, compared to a little more open canopy and a deeper soil depth, and even somewhat of a moderate or moloch horizon in that lower left slide. So structure, plant composition, processes. When I talk process, I'm thinking of the water cycle, the energy cycle, and nutrient cycling. They're all going to can be very different, even when we're talking about persistent woodlands. And then when we throw in the more recent sagebrush steppe, where woodlands have expanded into, we're even adding more to the complexity of these systems. Another component that I found frustrated when reviewing, I read a lot of papers, reviewed a lot of papers, and some are very good at this and some are not. But in terms of complete site descriptions, even talking about what were the pre and particularly post weather conditions following the research or the experiments. Many times these experiments are only short term, but this also occurs, I think, in any kind of landscape work that's being conducted with treatments, that this is information that's very important when it comes to interpreting why something worked or why something didn't work. Post weather, of course, if you treat something and you have a drought, that can really have an effect on what's going to happen. But soils are very important. Topographic positions, aspects have a real big impact. The type and severity of the treatments or the disturbance that might have occurred on that landscape, and definitely post-treatment management and disturbance processes that follow that, whether it was a vegetation treatment or a wildfire, are all going to have huge impacts on what happens to this landscape and what it's going to look like in 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years. In the history, which kind of gets into, I've always been interested in this, but I think it's important because then you get a feel for, at least in the past, prior to anthropogenic impacts, exactly what was going on in these landscapes. And there was, as you saw in that earlier figure, there was quite a change from glacial max to present as we entered the Holocene 10,000 years ago in climate, both temperatures across the Colorado Plateau and Great Basin and precip. And so, at least from the woodland standpoint, as did many other plant species associated with these woodlands, there was considerable amounts of expansion, retraction, infill, migration, and even extinction. However, the majority of vegetation that we see out there in the Great Basin, Colorado Plateau existed even during glacial max, but oftentimes at considerably lower elevations or different aspects. And part of the reason I think a lot of this vegetation was able to persist through such large changes is because, with particularly topographic differences, it could move fairly short distances and make changes in terms of temperature and moisture by moving up in elevation or migrating more from a south to a north aspect. This is just an example of some of Cole's work, did a lot of work in migration. The green M's stand for Pinus monophila. The blue E is Pinus edulis two needle, and you've got the F, Pinus edulis variety Phallax, which not everybody recognizes, but it's kind of basically similar to edulis, but it occurs in a bit of a drier climate. We know that edulis definitely needs to have a certain amount of summer precip, and it occurs probably where you have at least 35%. And I think Paul Tuller mentioned about 3 inches or more of summer precip to have edulis. And I know it occurs just about from the Wasatch and then going south and east, and it's where we start picking up about 35% or more precip. And you can see how much it's migrated from glacial maximum, which is the figure on the left, B, and then H in terms of how much it migrated to the north. And it wasn't all the same. It migrated considerably quicker along this border here, right along the Nevada, Arizona. By mid-Holocene, it was quite a ways up here to the north, whereas in the Great Basin, where we've got a line here, this would be probably this right here is we've got the White Mountains in this region and in the Inyo Mountains, and it didn't really drop into the Great Basin until maybe 4,000 years, and then it just didn't migrate up to this farther north point till about several centuries ago, around 300-400 years ago. And so it did definitely the pines were pushed quite a way south compared to where they were before. Juniper is an interesting one, and in terms of it was during glacial maximum, you can see my cursor here, it was pushed down to kind of the mouth where the Green River goes into the Colorado. And today it's quite a ways. It's actually up, you have it up into the Pocatello area and up in southeastern Idaho. What is interesting over here towards the western part of Nevada is that juniper, at least geographically, really didn't move. It's been there for at least 30,000 years, but it did move in elevation, and that was probably the way it was able to move, but it didn't move south. And in terms of western juniper, Peter Wigan and Robin Tausch and I feel, and there is some genetic evidence to support this, that it's a refuge, and where you have pure strains of genetic western junipers over the Redding, Northern California, the northern part of the Sacramento Valley and up around the Weed and Redding area. And it didn't move up into Oregon probably till about 4,000 years ago. So it moved in, and most of what western juniper we find on the east side of the Sierras and the Cascades has some genetics cross with the Utah juniper. The getting into what has happened in the past, in the past 200 years, I know there's a lot of debate in terms of the role of climate, the role of fire, the role of livestock. And I think one thing that helped me by looking at such a large geographic area and pouring through the literature is it gave me a better kind of a geographic context of things that seemed like they were in contrast to each other really started making sense. And part of that is when we were coming in, you figure European settlements started occurring in the late 1800s, but just prior to that, we were in the Little Ice Age. And there was actually, the paleobotanists talk about there being actually a gradual increase. Juniper had kind of crashed during a very dry period of, they call it a medieval period of about 900 to 1300 years ago. And it was a gradual increase up into about the time we started seeing the introduction of livestock in the 1860s, and then build up into the 1880s, early 1900s. Same period, we see dramatic declines in fire. There's a lot of evidence to show declines in fire frequencies throughout the West. And we're still kind of in this cool period. And then we have this, what's called the pluvial period, which from 1905 to 1917 was a relatively persistent wet period throughout both the Colorado Plateau and the Great Basin, which would have been ideal for cone production and seedling establishment of both pinyon and juniper. But the thing that we've also found that in a lot of the fire history work, that fires typically, large fires throughout the Colorado Plateau and Great Basin often occurred following wet periods where you had at least a couple of years where you had fuel buildups and then relatively dry or drought year. And those are the years that often we have large fires. And both the dendrochronology work shows that, as does a lot of the recent work that has been reported looking at more recent fires. And so what happened during this time period is we also, during this big buildup of fuel loads, is we had extremely high livestock densities on the landscape. So they would have had a dramatic impact on fuel loading and fine fuels during this time period. And so a lot of the big push in juniper encroachment, and expansion we see occurring during this 1900 period. You can see it's still occurring, but it starts to taper off. And this is, there is other chronologies that will show kind of a persistent, and then they'll be offset. But many of the chronologies kind of show this general pattern that we have this big push, an increase, and then a large push of the PJ during that early 1900s period. So oftentimes when we get debating, we had, during this time period, we had quite a bit of infill and expansion. But really work like that lower slide, it's a low sage, and a lot of old trees that grew. This site here really never produced defined fuel components. So grazing would have had a little impact whether it was grazed or not. There were occasional fires that occurred through these areas, but oftentimes they had limited impact. They would have taken out any young trees, but they would have had limited impact on the larger trees, maybe mortality of less than 25%. And we did report a couple fires that occurred in these types, and they occurred following several wet years. When you go to the upper slide, where you're going to not find older trees, oftentimes this has got a nice horizon, a moderately deep soil, production of 1,000 to 2,000 pounds of surface fuels per acre, and you'll find young trees coming in on this particular site. So on a site like this, definitely the reduction of fine fuels for heavy livestock grazing would have had a big impact on reducing any potential threat of fire, or definitely reducing its frequency. The other component that I feel in putting this together as well with the fire synthesis and some of the field guides is just how important it is to be able to evaluate landscapes and look at them. And the component is, I feel, one of the best skills, most important skills any kind of land manager can have, is to be able to look at a landscape and say, well, kind of the what ifs. If this burned by a wildfire, what it would look like in 10, 20 years, or if we did a shredding or a cutting, or we walked away from it, we would be able to pretty much come up and see what this landscape is going to do. And a lot of that comes from knowing what are the key questions to ask on this landscape. Even if you're not familiar with, you're new and you just happen to be the outsider looking at this, even though you may not know the soils that you have on this site, still you should be able to know what are the key questions that you need to ask. And I seem to be missing those, but there some of the key components is you need to know what the soils are on the site, what the depths, textures, and what if they've got a mollusk horizon on them or not, what elevation are we at, what's the topographic, what is the topographic position, and really getting into what the soil moisture regimes, the ecological site conditions are. So we'll go into that, just spend a minute or two on that. It kind of gets down into then the reasons why. Okay, here's 4 different sites. The one in the upper right was cut. The one in the upper left was shredded. And then the one down in the lower left was shredded. And then we have a burn. And we all had a really good response in terms of the recruitment. And the component is there's a good reason as to why that occurred. And that is that these sites had high resilience and resistance. And that had to do with the stuff that was there before the treatment. It was already there and basically ready to come back. The elevation of these sites and aspects, they had fairly high resistance. They were in a kind of a cool, moisture regime. The site up there that was up on the upper left is just north of or just south of Ely, Nevada. And so we're probably about 7,000 feet in elevation there, at least 7,000 feet. And we're definitely in a cool, moisture regime, limited cheatgrass on this site prior. And so there was a very good response. And so all the factors were in place that would have driven these sites to have a very good response. We look at these sites and we see a very different response. From one site up on the first one in the upper right was chained over 50 years ago. I don't have any records on this site, but I can tell you most likely, knowing the history of the area, that after treatment, it was post-treatment grazing was probably was relatively heavy. The goals and objectives of this chaining were to increase winter range for big game animals, and that would have meant pushing shrubs. There was evidence, I was told by Steve Monson, that this area had both mountain big sage and bitterbrush on it, which basically were gone by the time they went in and chained this area. And you can see it came right back the primary understory is sandbridge bluegrass, and yet this is a moderately deep soil. So on this particular site, it should be growing deep-rooted perennial grasses. The site on the upper left is primarily cheatgrass and Medusa head. This was a wildfire, so it was a high-intensity fire. There were some native perennials on this site prior to it burning, but a high-intensity fire, a lot of these native perennials can persist, can handle fire quite well, but when you have relatively high duration burning, we had a fair amount of mortality, and it was not in the greatest shape. It was relatively close to town. So this site has had a history in the past of pretty fairly high grazing. And you can see in the lower two images burning. These sites are at fairly high elevation, but the one is on a south, the one on the lower right is on a south aspect. And so that's a problem. The one on the lower left is a fairly high elevation, kind of the easterly aspect, but I suspect, I don't have the information, that likely these sites were pretty limited in the deep-rooted perennial component. And I know a lot of you have seen this occurs in the field guide, but it's just, to me, a very good model to continually to go back to, that when you look at plant succession or what's the recovery potential on these sites, they're going to really be driven. The ecological site characteristics are extremely important. And the basic three components of the ecological sites are topography, climate, and soils. And they really should tell you what the potential is on that particular site, what the potential vegetation likely was prior to any heavy disturbance. The other component that's really important is current vegetation. And on the warmer and drier sites you have, the more important that current vegetation is, because it's really the only thing that's going to really keep out the invasive species, because you have the right soil moisture temperature regimes that they're very well adapted to. And of course, with climate change, we're going to see greater effect of that as we move higher up in elevation. Pre-post treatment weather, of course, are having big effects, as does the treatment, disturbance and treatment following, or I should say the disturbance or treatment that occurred. How severe was the fire or the prescribed burn, or you get into more cutting and shredding, those have a lower impact on the particular site. And then, of course, what follows after those treatments occur. And so I want to say, even if you know the right question to ask, doesn't mean that you're always going to get the results that you hope to, particularly on those sites that are right in between. It's easy to evaluate the sites that are low elevation, hot, dry, and knowing what the threat of cheatgrass is. Oftentimes those sites are not in very good condition to begin with. And the high elevation sites that have cold, wet, good condition. But we get into those sites, particularly along the border, the Wyoming and Mount Big Sage, and it gets more difficult. This is a site that we treated, and this is you can see with the foliage on the trees, it's only this is just a couple years following treatment, but this site, I've been back to it, and there was a lot of microsites on this where just, you can see the people standing in the right, or over in the right corner, just past them, you drop into a north slope, and it's just a beautiful stand of blue bunch wheatgrass. You come on this is kind of a general, mostly west, tipping slightly to the south. We've got a lot of snakeweed, a little bit of mustard, and we were back in there 5 years later, and we had quite a bit of cheatgrass on this site. So you walk across this treatment, and there's sites that look really, really good. The perennial forb component responded real well on this site. On some portions, and other portions just don't look very good at all. And this would have been a situation where part of the study on this one was not to do any reseeding, but this would be a site, if I were going to go back in, it would be a site that if you were to reseed it, definitely would be done in patches where it needed it. And there were definitely sites that did not need that. But we need to be concerned with both what's the future for this site, and then again, the ecological processes and the watershed component, as I know that Kareth Snyder and Jason Williams talked quite a bit about are kind of non-conserving versus conserving systems, or as we always said, sites that we're trying to increase the ability of these sites to capture soil moisture, store it, and safely release. And so, as I mentioned, that the synthesis, it's quite long. I think there's about 1,000 citations, and it definitely doesn't include all of the literature, but I really hope that it provides, again, easy access to information that people are seeking that can help them do planning and trying to interpret. Again, I think it's extremely important it's good to know if we've had a failure, why was it a failure? And if we have success, why was it success? We really need to know that kind of information to be able to progress into the future and dealing particularly with many challenges of invasive species and a continuing changing climate. With that, Janie, I'd turn it over to you if you're still there and haven't fallen asleep.
No, that was very interesting. I definitely did not fall asleep. Yeah, thanks, Rick. Okay, if you have questions, please type them into the questions window of your control panel. And I'll start with the first couple of questions. In parts of Colorado, we refer to old PJ as legacy trees. We use a 12-inch DBH to help us define this. Is this a good evaluation technique?
Well, it's, I guess, quick and easy, but if I were up in an area and someone said is 12 inches going to work, some areas it will and some areas it won't. The more productive sites, and depending on how close the stands are, if they're relatively open or productive, a 12-inch tree could easily be under 150 years old. I would go and evaluate a site and look at and ask, will 12 inches work? And then look at the morphology of the tree. And I know in our field guides, we have some good photographs showing the changes in bark characteristics that occur, the change in leader growth, the change in branching that occurs as you start pushing past 150 years and particularly get to about 200 years. So if I were, again, in an area, I would look at it and say, yeah, 12 inches will work in this particular area, but on this site, 12 inches, obviously these 12-inch trees. I've seen some pretty big, up on Steens, we had some protective sites. I've seen some pretty big juniper that were only 80, 90 years old. So again, that'll vary by site, and of course the stand density of the trees themselves.
Great, thank you. Next question, what would have been the density of juniper in shrub steppe historically in the northern Great Basin / Oregon?
Probably just everything. I think we had shrub steppe communities that have high enough frequency that they persisted as shrub steppe communities. And again, it would depend on seed source. Juniper seeds can disseminate quite a distance with birds, but the vast majority of seeds are going to be disseminated probably within just several hundred meters of the trees. But I'm sure we had areas that were really persistent shrub steppe communities, grassland communities, and these intact communities would have definitely slowed down the movement of trees, so less frequent fire would have been required. But I'm sure we also had sites, particularly where we see these mosaics of shrubs and trees, to where there was a continual balancing act between the trees kind of moving in and starting to establish on some of these shrub steppe communities, and then a fire coming in, removing it, turning it to grass, the shrubs come in, and so there was a continual kind of back and forth. I don't know if people can see the picture that I'm showing on the screen here, for example. Behind us, we had a sharp, steep north slope, which had a high and a really good fire history of really short return intervals. And this particular site, we didn't find any old trees unless you're on a little microsite. And I'm sure the trees were always kind of trickling in on this site, but this would have been a persistent stand with maybe anything from, no trees to, just occasionally very low density trees. If you look back just on the kind of the horizon, on the nearest horizon, you'll see quite a few more trees. We get into a total different soils there, very rocky, shallow, and we suddenly start picking up a patch there of old trees that fire obviously had gone around and allowed those trees. So you would have had pretty much most everything. There, I failed to mention that I think in the old paleo information, it showed that that many of the trees had a pretty good understory. The pollen data showed they had a pretty good understory of vegetation, and we do see that since in the last 200 years, persistent woodlands have significantly increased in density. And I think that's where we're starting to see more stand replacement events. Mesa Verde has seen that. I know up in some of the Nevada country, they've had some large stand replacement events, and in part that may have a lot to do with an increase of large infill that's occurred in areas that probably fire didn't play a big role, but it did. But again, there's been a huge variety of thinking of seed source and what the fire regimes were in that particular area in terms of density of trees and shrub steppe.
Great, thank you. Next question, very interesting, thank you. Any thoughts on the importance and feasibility of mycorrhizal inoculation for small to large scale restoration?
No, that's an area that I don't have a lot of background. We did cover a little bit of it in terms of what species of mycorrhizal are found in, and there's a difference between Pinyon and Juniper, which I found quite interesting. But I know there's debate. I'm sure that there's been some work done in Doug fir, I know, that showed that lacking certain mycorrhiza in the area that had initially been a Doug fir stand, and where the Doug fir had been removed for quite some time period, they found really reduced the regrowth or the reestablishment of Doug fir in that particular site. So I don't have a lot of background in that, and there's not been a huge amount of information. There is some in terms of looking at the importance in terms of restoration efforts with the mycorrhizal, but I'm sure they play a role.
Yeah, and for the person who asked the question, if you want to email me after the fact, I can put you in touch with people who that is their background and hopefully get you some more information.
Okay, that'd be good. Yeah, and we did have, like I said, we did cover some in the synthesis, but probably didn't address it as much as it really needed to be addressed.
Okay, thank you. What proportion of the post-treatment studies reviewed had a non-grazing control?
Boy, I don't know if I can answer that question. I would say there were significant. Some of them had, I know some of the more recent ones had non-grazing. A lot of the sage steppe, for example, plots had well, they didn't really have it. They were non-grazing just because we covered such a huge area, and that was a factor that we couldn't control to make it consistent in terms of the grazing treatment to be the same across that area. So it's real mixed. I think many of the studies did not have any kind of grazing control, and which could cause some problems. And I know we've seen some areas where we had one fence line contrast in one of the Nevada sites that had not been grazed inside versus outside. There's areas that we had really good response, and there was grazing going on, and we had a very positive response. But I can think of a couple of other areas where there was the grazing was fairly heavy, and it did have a big impact on the treatment outside, and where we had fenced in just a portion of that treatment. So again, the impacts of grazing on vegetation treatments, I think it's all over the board from appropriate to non-appropriate. And the timing that these areas need to rest really depend a lot on what their level of resistance and resilience are. The area, the cooler, the moister the sites, and if you had a really good stand of vegetation prior to treatment, definitely amount of time that they need to be deferred is going to be a lot shorter than a site that has lower resilience and resistance and or is in poor condition, or a lot of the understory was fairly depleted. So I don't know what the percent was, but a lot of those treatments were not fenced, so they would have been grazing, and some of them probably on the heavier side, some where maybe there just wasn't water nearby and the grazing was relatively light.
Okay, great, thank you. Can you summarize PJ water use with depth or evapotranspiration rates, changes in landscape scale evapotranspiration following treatment or fire?
Yeah, there has been work there, and I know Jason, Karith, Fred addressed that. And there's kind of two levels of treatment in terms of water, say below ground water cycles. One is what's going on in the upper couple of feet, which is important from a lot of the surface component of herbaceous vegetation, and that we see usually after a PJ treatment, we see an immediate increase in soil moisture available in the upper several feet, say 1 to 2 feet. But then after 2 or 3 years, if we had a really good herbaceous response, we don't see much of a difference, because the evapotranspiration rate basically has increased because of it's gone from juniper to the herbaceous component that's using the water. In terms of greater depth, one of the eye openers for us was some of the early work when John Bates, he was my grad student, and we did a study where we left some young trees on an area that we cut and removed all the other trees. We had adjacent uncut areas. And the small trees, which are relatively stunted, really took off. And even though we had a large herbaceous response, those trees were definitely pumping water from down deeper. So when everything went dormant above ground, they were still actively growing. We did some water potential work and transpiration work on them, and they were still growing and active, whereas the young small trees in the adjacent site were pretty well shut down because that deeper pool of water was was already tapped out. Getting into the hydrology of subsurface fuels, that's an area they do address in that chapter, but it's kind of all over the board, and it depends a lot on the geology, the amount of snow that you get, and just the whole climate in terms of the contribution of. In some areas, they say, well, these areas are too dry, you don't get enough precip to really contribute to the subsurface, but then you'll find some studies that kind of find to the contrast of that. So I think it has a lot to do with both the climate regime in that particular area and the geology in terms of how water's captured and moved on that site.
Great, thank you. There's quite a few more great questions, but just for the few folks who have asked where they can find the recording, the GoToWebinar system will send you a follow-up email automatically tomorrow, and all that information will be posted there. All right, we'll continue with questions. When looking at establishment rates, the slide that says the past 200 years, does that curve only represent trees still alive at the time of sampling, or does it reflect trees that established and died and are no longer present at the time of sampling? If not, why can we be certain the establishment patterns shown are an accurate look at the history of these species over that time period?
Okay, the studies, I know at least we had quite a bit of the chronology studies, and we did include anything that was on the site. Of course, record all the live trees on the site, but we also record any stumps or logs that we found on the site. And on those, some we actually could get ages on, many of them we could not. But just by discerning, looking at what we could, we assumed that they were definitely pre-settlement trees, and we also lumped them into that pre-settlement component. So the that graph definitely would change. That was more probably a graph representing primarily areas that had been recently expanded into. And in the graph, I know Biondi and several other figures, they do show where they were working in persistent woodlands, they would look very different. And I know we have a publication that Robin and MacArthur and a group of us did that covered Utah, Nevada, and we sampled both old growth stands and young stands, and you can definitely see there's a much higher proportion of old trees pre-settlement on those sites. But what's interesting is just how much the density has increased in many of those stands since, in terms of what we call infill, since the period, say, of 1900. And that gets tough to really try to sort that out. Like, again, some of the early paleobotany work tends to indicate, and again, indicate that there was more of an understory component within many of the old persistent juniper woodlands, but that we see some that are quite open and some that are quite closed. And so the reason for these infilling, and these are areas that would obviously tell you that there's been a change in climate that allowed that to happen. And then we argue that some of these sites where it could have that climate component would have also increased the fire potential, would have maintained a lot of these shrub steppes as shrub steppes, but we would have definitely have seen, they really probably anthropogenic had little impact on the increase within these stands. At least some of them. Some of them might have had a decent herbaceous layer, and we do see, like some of the work in ponderosa pine, that if you have a good herbaceous layer, it's pretty tough for a juniper or pinyon seedling to get established. But once they're established, even once they're young, they have no trouble competing with that herbaceous layer. So there's definitely some gray areas that I kind of think about and really have not totally sorted out in terms of what these stands really look like, say, 500 to 1,000 years ago to what's going on today. But we do know that during transition periods in the past of cool, wet to warm, dry, there would be increases in charcoal and ash in sampling in many areas. We'll have paleobotany work, and major declines in pinyon juniper woodlands. And then you get in these kind of cool, wet periods, and we'd see some increase, but also, again, fire would have been playing a role at the same time as you'd be seeing this increase. So it gets a little tangled up as you go farther back.
Great, thanks. Do you feel that there are areas of older juniper, those that have pre-settlement morphological characteristics, in low sage, dwarf sage communities that are justified for removal where sage grouse are present?
That, I guess, that's you'd have to look at what the total objectives are for that particular area. And I know there was one old growth stand over outside of the Bend area that had trees. In fact, we cross-dated some of the old dead trees that went back. The oldest pit date we had was 200 BC, and oldest trees were going back to 1600 years of age. And because there was a major lek area on the other side of the ridge, they started cutting that, thinking they could increase sagebrush on that particular area. And I talked to them about it, and they did stop and did not complete that clearing because that area had never been that had been a persistent woodland for a long, long time. And I know I've been out on tours where that gets pretty heatedly debated, but I guess my feeling is where would have been the Great Leks, if that's a potential high priority sage grouse area, historically, where would the leks have been and where would the nesting have been? And so obviously there would have been other areas that likely would have supported and it would have been the low sage areas if you had any kind of relatively low densities of trees. If you have more than 3%, probably right around 3%, definitely less than say anything 5% or 3% or 5% cover of trees tends to definitely see a significant decrease in the use for nesting on those sites by sage grouse. So they must have been doing it somewhere else. So I would throw out a number of questions before, unless you were really desperate for a particular area to be removing those trees.
Great, thank you. Is CO2 enrichment of the atmosphere helping juniper use water more efficiently and be more drought resistant?
Very likely, yes. And we do touch on that on the warming, that's definitely likely. However, it's a two-edged sword. Is also, there's some pretty good data to show that things like cheatgrass, red brome, and medusa head also are very favored by increased CO2 enrichment. So that's, that also increases the invasive species. There's some concern with early warming in the spring. And we touched on this, and this is pretty limited data, but there's some indications that early warming and breaking dormancy could really reduce drought resistance of these trees early in that season of having that early dormancy broken. And then, of course, drought really decreases the resistance of these trees to pests, insect pests. So much of the major die-offs have been tied with drought and insects. So it's that CO2 thing is yes, the whole climate change CO2, yes. Some of the warming and drying, probably not. And then the invasive question of the big push of invasive species with increased CO2.
Okay, great. Tell us about infill of pinyon and or juniper into persistent PJ landscapes. Is it widespread? What was driving it? Does it require management?
Okay, so yes, it's widespread. We have a table that shows a huge amount. I tried to find all the chronology studies that have been done. A lot of them have not been published. And we found quite a few. And the infill is widespread. And the infill tends to occur in most, not all woodlands we've looked at. Many of them it occurs. This looks pretty similar in terms of the big push. It comes in the late 1800s and early 1900s, particularly early 1900s. And I think it was climate driven that really pushed that increase of infill. I think that that infill definitely, there's some evidence showing that increased density will increase or decrease the resistance of those trees to drought. And there's been some papers showing, well, not really, but there's been enough papers showing, yeah, that drought definitely is a factor, that if you have increased tree density, which you would think more competition, you're less growth, less phloem layers to get water pumped up, that it's going to have an impact. So a decrease in drought, but then also increased tree canopy, which is going to increase with a certain amount of wind, a greater potential of stand replacement fire compared to a more of a thinning type of fire, which we saw at the Lava Beds National Monument. We saw one where there were some old trees growing up on a thin kind of soiled area right up next to an area that had a mix of pine and juniper that had a very short return interval. And those trees were able to persist in that interval. But then after they had a wildfire go up on one of those areas, the canopy had really connected and had connected to those old trees. Wildfire had taken those old trees out. So I guess it would depend on resources and priorities, but thinning old stands that might make them more persistent, definitely could be something to think about.
Great, thanks. Okay, there's 7 more questions, and these are really great. So yeah, so hopefully it's all right with everyone if we hang in there a little bit.
Yeah, I feel like I'm taking my PhD orals, which were just a few decades ago when I did that.
All right. You did work looking at precip the year or two before a large fire. Did you also look at precip after large fires to see if there were any patterns as far as increased precipitation that might help with reestablishing perennial grasses or forbs, or was it probably too variable?
Well, it was probably too variable. You know, the establishment of large fires prior to, we found that with a lot of the dendrochronology work up in our area and through part of the Great Basin. And then I know Tom Swetnam's group down the dendrochronology lab for the Southwest have found the same thing. And then recent work has shown that again, I think it kind of comes up to a accumulation of fine fuels and a couple of wet years, and then boom, you have a major fire. And those big fires can have quite an impact on the Chihuahuacan Basin. It also took out most of the aspen, and that's where we also lost about 25% of our old growth in that one big fire in 1855 in a low sage community. That was shallow soil, Sandberg's bluegrass was what you would expect and was the dominant grass. Post fire, it gets tougher in terms of it is very highly variable, and I don't think we have enough good information on post fire effects of climate on those. And part of this gets also down to the longevity of many studies. You know, unfortunately, the majority of studies are less than 5 years, and we're getting a few more that are 10 years and 20 years out. And I've seen a real mix. I know Kirk Davies' group just came out with a paper that looked at a number of fires across the Great Basin to look at its effects on cheatgrass and compared it to mechanical control. And a lot of the short-term work shows that pretty consistently that in the first few years, you're going to have a higher increase in cheatgrass on those burn sites than you will on the mechanical treatments. And a lot of that, of course, is always going to be because, one, you get an increase in available nitrogen, and two, you get a reduction in competition. You probably remove shrubs, and many of the perennial grasses are not back in that first year, but they'll come back very quickly if it was not too high a severity fire. And you get increased soil temperatures also on that surface, that black surface. And what they found was that over time, that they're at 20 years out or so, that there really was not a big difference in the cheatgrass component between mechanical and burning after the fact. That it really was driven by the environmental factors of soil moisture and temperature regimes and the condition of that site, if they knew it, the amount of deep-rooted perennial grasses they had on those sites. And so I think a lot of those factors are going to be very important. And if you have drought is hard on cheatgrass as it is on our desirable plants. And you get good moist years, and good moist years are great for our desirable plants, but if they're good year, but they're also very good for cheatgrass. So it's more, I think, a matter of the inherent resilience of that site due to elevation, moisture, temperatures, but also the big player is what the pre-treatment or disturbance vegetation was prior, and how quickly then is it able to come back and overtake the cheatgrass. And if there's not enough of it there, and it's particularly on these warmer, drier sites, it's going to be unlikely, and particularly Wambig sagebrush. Studies have been done on Wambig sagebrush shows if you get a flush of cheat right after a fire, that the Wambig sagebrush just very limited to almost no recruitment. And so that's kind of a lot of variation in that. So I think it gets down to the ecological site factors as well as what the current vegetation was at the time of the disturbance.
Great, thanks. The next question, have you looked at impacts of the season of PJ removal, dormant or growing season? I have observed in New Mexico that in some years, pinyon removal during the summer rainy season, the remaining trees seem to suffer more in successive years, especially during droughts and during high wind events.
Yeah, could you read the last part of that question again in terms of the removal of pinyon in New Mexico?
I've observed in New Mexico that in some years, pinyon removal during the summer rainy season leaves, sorry, they were probably trying to type quickly. So it says remaining trees seem to suffer more in successive years, especially during droughts and during high wind events.
Yeah, Boy, I really, there's not a lot of information. There has been some work looking at season of treatment, um, particularly with pile and burning, the difference between if you burn when the grounds are frozen, you get a much lesser impact of the area below the slash versus when you burn earlier when it's warmer, and those areas below the slash can be real hot spots, and which oftentimes can come into cheatgrass. And so suddenly you have a cheatgrass seed source possibly on the site. So there's been some differences there. Definitely the timing of burning in seasons could have a huge impact on fire severity. And sometimes you need enough to get the fire to carry, but if the fire and for example, high severity fires, which oftentimes are wildfires, you can have as much as 80 or more % mortality of your deep-rooted perennial grasses compared to, say, low severity fires, which you could have 90% survival. I don't have a lot of experience within New Mexico. You're talking monosperma, but I'm guessing if it's going to have a lot to do with soil surface temperatures after the removal and moisture and how moisture is captured and held in those soil profiles in terms of recruitment of trees or recruitment of the vegetation. And it would just be what's going on with the microenvironment characteristics that would be a result of removing that tree canopy.
Great, thanks. Any thoughts about how cultural burning practices would have historically impacted PJ woodlands compared to lightning starts?
Yeah, well, now there's one you can get into a lot of debate on. And, everyone from thinking Native Americans had a significant impact. And also the big debate is just how many were on the landscape prior to European diseases kind of spreading across the continent. And to the degree that they burned, and as it's been written up, that, for example, a lot of times the Native Americans, when they were traveling or hunting, they really did put their fires out if they had campfires. So I thought a lot about that, and probably likely have the two extremes of, major significant to the other minimal impact to somewhere in between. And I think, again, it just, when you consider how complex the landscape is, I think that Native American burning probably was quite significant in some areas and probably quite limited in other areas. And even if in some of the Oregon area, I know there was some local burning on areas that were real important for biscuit root, some of the lomatium plants. And and I know some of the work that's been done down in California looking at Native American burning, which was pretty spatial in terms of where they burned and where they didn't. And I'm not sure there's, in the Southwest, there were probably certain tribes that fire occurred, but they weren't probably really practicing any kind of, quote, prescribed burning for landscape vegetation management, where there were other tribes that probably were very much practicing making those practices. So I think there's areas where they probably did have impact, and other areas where it was pretty minor. Lightning definitely played a big component, particularly where you have in the northern Great Basin, where you have dry lightning storms, very little moisture that occurs in the summer, compared to, say, Colorado Plateau, where you get a lot more moisture with those lightning storms. So that's a hard one, and you can come up with any answer. But I feel pretty comfortable in terms of just saying, well, I think it was very spatial in terms of where they had significant effects with prescribed burning and where they had little to no effects on using prescribed burning.
Great, thank you. As you mentioned, there is a lot of infill happening in these persistent woodlands. What is your theory on what prevented infill historically?
That's a great question. I wish I had an answer for it. That's something that's really, one of those things that I've gone through this whole process. There's some things I feel much better about. I've even had like Nicole Barger, who we for a long time have had friendly debates on the role of fire. And when I got talking to her about the regional differences and where fire probably played a role and didn't, and kind of talked to it, she finally said, it finally is making sense, because there's areas where I felt fire had a major effect, but then I'd look at these areas where I knew were old woodlands, and yet I'm seeing significant infill. And a lot of, the tree age looks very similar to what I'm seeing in areas that I feel that had been more persistent shrub steppe communities. And in terms of and when you look at, I talked to Peter Wigan about this, and you read through the literature, and they talk about these more, quote, open woodlands. What, you would have thought, well, of course, the easy answer would be low intensity fires, kind of like the Ponderosa Pine system. But we really don't have any evidence of that, not least in the last few centuries. They don't really show, that likely probably occurred in some areas. We have in the pumice region in Oregon, we have some very open stands of maybe 15 to 20% old trees with a beautiful stand of Idaho fescue and scattered stands of shrubs. And that one is really there's not been much infill on that particular site. And so whether it had been just a balance where you had enough competition, so the questions you got to ask are, okay, if it had really been more open in the past, suddenly you got this big surge. It could be several things. One is that maybe over time they tended to be more open, but there were these cycles where you get the right climate events to where suddenly they'd infill. You had big stand replacement events of drought, fire, insects, and it thinned those stands or had stand replacement events, and then they came back again and tended to be more open. Another would be that was there enough of a herbaceous component to really limit the little trees from coming in? And so you tended to have these long, persistent, tight stands of more open. And what role would have grazing played in reducing that competition? And I think in some areas of the landscape, it probably could have played a significant role, but there's others. I know with some of Nicole's work down on No Man's Mesa and Deer Mesa, they looked at an area that had been grazed and an area that had not been grazed. Two mesas, one mesa where there had been little grazing because it was so isolated. And they basically found that there was really very little difference in the stands between grazed and ungrazed. But if you looked at the ungrazed stand, herbaceous component the cover was only 5%, was very low to begin with. Both these sites showed that they had quite a bit of old growth on them. So obviously fire really didn't play much of a role. And if the No Man's Mesa, which had not been grazed, was representative of what that area had looked like for a long period of time, grazing and reducing a herbaceous canopy of 5% or less really would have had very little impact on any kind of fire regime on that site. So you kind of get down to one of those great discussions of, okay, if these were tended to be more open, what would have been potential reasons for that? And compared to then why has infill occurred? And I know the infill, I think obviously has occurred recently because of climate. That's a big driver of the ideal conditions, particularly in that moist period of the early 1900s. But what was going on earlier, it's more difficult. That's a more difficult one to get a handle on why. It would have to boil down to, okay, fire kept it more open, but there's no evidence to support that. If those sites could have supported, had a deeper soil, could have supported a herbaceous layer, competition could have been a factor, as well as possibly low intensity fires. But some of these areas have pretty shallow restrictive layers to where they probably never did produce a lot of herbaceous or surface fuels in the understory. So that's a great question. And one I'd love to get together with a group of people with some good background and really talk that one out, because that's to see, what would be the major possibilities of that.
Great, thanks. Just a few more. How important is warming and changing climate on PJ encroachment into sagebrush communities? Is it a more important factor in compared to lack of fires? Or do you think that lack of fire is a more important factor?
Okay. Definitely the reduction of fire in areas that had definitely the surface fuels to burn. You know, fire has been a major, I think, has played a major role in those areas that had been. There's good evidence to show they'd been persistent sagebrush communities over a long time. Again, based on soil, surface fuel production, and kind of what we see in terms of age structure on the landscape, and looking again very carefully at is there evidence of old charred logs and stumps, and in terms of is this something reestablishing? So fire is an important component. In terms of warming temperatures, what warming temperatures will do will increase the elevation of where those trees can move up, but it's going to also probably cause a retreat down at the lower elevations, particularly where the trees that are established here are probably going to persist, but any new recruitment will be limited. And there's been some really neat old paleobotany studies done in the White Mountains down in California that have looked at that over the last quite a few thousands of years, is the effect of cooling, of seeing the bristlecone and limber pine drop, as does the PJ drop in elevation. And then as we get warming, and which we're seeing now, there's a great spot on the White Mountains that show a picture of an open slope with no bristlecone on it, that this slope is above any of the other old bristlecone, and this slope the last 50 years is really coming into bristlecone, so it's moving up. And so the PJ, definitely the warming temperatures will allow the PJ to move farther up, but sadly, it's also going to allow the invasive species to move up. And I think with particularly down in the warmer, lower elevation areas, we get these warmer, hotter climates. We get a stand replacement event, and they come into invasive annuals. And some of those sites, the question is PJ going to come back in or not? And we definitely have a whole different fire regime if we have a pretty dense cycle. So fire is changing as climate changes, as it influences fuels from both native and invasives. But so climate would allow movement upslope and maybe make it more competitive in some of the mountain brush zones where we are, say, down in central Nevada. I know in the Steens, we're seeing kind of a creeping up above 7,500 feet, above 7,000 feet. So it's a combination, climate. And I think Neil or Henry Wright, kind of the father of range fire, made a comment that you can't, even though climate is an extremely important component, you can't separate it from other disturbances, particularly fire, because it's so intertwined.
Excellent, thanks. How does rooting distribution of juniper differ between species and its ecohydrology?
I'd have to kind of go back and view, but they're tremendous at putting out quite a lateral root system. And even though they'll put down a taproot in their early juvenile stage, generally most high percentage of them will lose that taproot. But even though they can put out a fairly extensive lateral root system, they're very good at moving down. I know in the salt regions, you have the salt's classic for that's your underlying bedrock for cracking and fracturing, and they're very good at moving roots down through those cracks and searching for water. And there's been some work showing, I think Pinyon can do this, can do the same. So if there's a way of getting through a hard pan, and I know we have some really shallow soils with hard pans, maybe at 6 and 8 inches down, where you have really low sage, that the low sage is only 6 to 8 inches high, Sandberg's bluegrass, and that tells you have a soil that's going to be a very shallow, less than 12 inches. That if you have trees growing on that site, those trees are not surviving in that upper 12-inch zone. They're definitely punching roots down deeper. And any of the water potential work that we've done in the past definitely shows that when we've done that one study I mentioned that John Basin and I did, where we were looking at water potential on the trees, we were collecting soil moisture down to 2 feet, down to where we had a hard pan. And basically there was no moisture down there later in the summer, and yet the young trees where we had been cut, and we left a few lower trees. Those trees were tapping water from below that hard pan, so they can get their roots down, I think, fairly deep. And there's a section on rooting in the census that you can easily go right to, and that'll describe, the work that's been done, and it's limited. It's been some work done on juveniles and limited work. It's just a big job. It's hard to talk grad students into excavating major areas to see what the roots are doing on mature trees.
Great. Okay, if the climate begins to get more consistent moisture, would the tree species change? Which ones?
Well, definitely the pinyon are less drought tolerant than juniper, but the pinyon are less cold tolerant than juniper, even though they tend to grow up at higher elevations above the juniper zone. And I think a lot of that has to do with it, that just they're more competitive once they get up out of the area where you have those inversion layers in the basin. And so the pinyon are, and generally with drought mortality, oftentimes a lot of the big drought mortality that's occurred in Colorado Plateau, the vast majority of the trees dying are pinyon compared to juniper. But part of that could be not only drought stress, but there's a lot more critters that find pinyon a lot of pest insects that find pinyon more, we call it palatable or more likable than they do juniper. So the cooling and increased moisture would benefit pinyon, but if it gets too cold, I think that's what during the glacial max was really limiting the movement of pinyon up north. And once it warmed up enough, then the pinyon was able to migrate north. I think one of the issues we're dealing with now with current conditions is more dramatic swings. And of course, climate change, we're talking long trends, but dramatic swings in terms of you get a few wet years and then you get some real dry years. And those are just setting you up for large fires. So definitely the persistence of the pluvial period, when it was kind of wet and cool during that early 1900s period, the trees definitely took advantage of that period. And we saw a big increase during that, both in infill and expansion. But what we kind of removed from the equation was fire, because there was some fire prevention going on, but not significant on rangelands pre-World War II. But because still there were large numbers of livestock on the range, particularly during that pre-World War II era. So we don't really know during that wet period, would there have been an increase? How much I think there's enough evidence to show fire regimes were changed, altered, and at least on areas where they were producing fine fuels. And the question is, how different would the landscape look like today if fire regimes really had been able to kind of continue their own mode without that reduction of fine fuel loads? And I'm sure we still would have seen the infill, definitely, but I think it would have made a difference in where we were seeing. It would have limited expansion into a lot of shrub steppe, particularly shrub steppe productive communities.
All right. And last question, has there been any correlation with El Nino and La Nina with success of recovery post-treatment, whether that be invasives or favoring invasives or natives?
Well, definitely, as they're influencing moisture and temperature, which, they're strong indicators of what post-treatment moisture may be or occur, that cool temperatures and moisture are favor the native component. Moisture and warm temperatures, not as much. And warm temperatures and dry is going to probably in the long run tend to favor the invasive species. But definitely warm, moist will very much will favor the invasive species. So the cool, moist is going to be in favor of the natives. So as we predict, how those are influencing that pattern, particularly in seeding, we know that if we have a limited amount of cheatgrass on the site prior to, say, a wildfire or a treatment, or even if we have a pretty good sagebrush canopy, a depleted native perennial, but we do have an understory of cheat, that if we have a fire go through there, usually it'll be hot enough to combust most of that cheatgrass seed. You'll have at least a 1-year window for seeding. And if you have a cool, moist conditions following that, you're going to have greater success of seeding. If you had very limited canopy cover of sage and you had a big major component of cheatgrass and a fire went through there, you're talking about a rapid low intensity fire. And so you're going to have a lot of cheatgrass laying on that surface just ready to go. And if you seed into that, the chance of success is going to be very, very low, because you'll have explosion of cheat that first year after fire, where if you had a good sage canopy and that was combusted, you should have at least a 1-year window. But cool, moist conditions always favor us. Warm, dry do not, in terms of native perennial and management.
Great. Well, Rick, I think you passed your exams.
Okay, thank you. I hope so.
Yeah, that was so many great questions. Thank you, everyone. And sure. Rick, man,
excellent question.
Yeah, and thanks for hanging in there, Rick. That's probably the longest questions session we've ever done.
Okay. Good. Well, it was great to have participants, and thank you.
Yeah. So I'm gonna put on screen here if it will show up. Oh, what did I do? There we go. Here's some instructions for obtaining continuing education credits through SER and SRM. This information will also be sent to you tomorrow with the follow-up email, as well as the link to the recording. And I'll also post links for some of the publications that Rick has mentioned. If you are available on May 27th, our next webinar is New Tools for Pinyon Juniper Management, Balancing the Needs of Sagebrush and Woodland Obligate Birds, with Jason Tack and Jeremy Maestas. So please tune in for that if you can. And we'd greatly appreciate it if you'd take the 3-question survey that appears at the close of the webinar. All right, thank you again. Thanks for all the great questions, and thank you so much, Rick, for the great presentation.
Okay, you bet.
All right, have a great day, everyone.